And now we're joined by Carl Bildt, former Prime Minister of Sweden, whom I'm very pleased to welcome on air. Thank you for being with us. First of all, I'd like to ask you to paint the scene. European leaders and Zelensky get on a call with Donald Trump after his conversation with Putin, and Trump tells them that they've agreed to start negotiations immediately. How do they react? What conclusions do they draw from that, in your opinion?
Well, I think that utter disbelief, because they had been communicating with Trump before the meeting, before the call, and during the last several days, and I think they were quite happy that there had been an amazing degree of transatlantic unity around the call for a ceasefire, 30 days and whatever following after that, but that was the key. And they, of course, expected President Trump to press that particular demand on President Putin. And instead, they found him doing exactly the opposite. Instead of starting with a ceasefire and then political talks, now evidently President Trump agreed with Putin and said ceasefire is for the future. So I think they must have been utterly surprised and somewhat upset.
And what will their next steps be, Mr. Bildt, considering the shock? What will the Europeans do in light of Trump's position?
Well, I mean, the only thing they can do, and the thing they must do, and I think they will do, is to reinforce the support for Ukraine. Because what has happened after this particular telephone call is a signal de facto from President Trump to President Putin that you can continue the war. There will be talks, yes, but changes of papers and whatever, but no one expects very much to come out of that in the near term. So the outcome of this particular conflict will be decided again in the battlefield. And that is primarily the determination of the Ukrainians themselves, but they are dependent upon also the financial and material support that can be given by the West, and in this case, primarily by the European countries. So they must now reinforce and, if possible, step up that particular support. That is the significant contribution that the Europeans can and must do.
Are they ready to provide the support, in your view? I know you're in touch with many people, Mr. Bildt, and you have an excellent network of contacts. But is there really a willingness to help? Because I see many complaining we don't have enough weapons ourselves, or how long can we keep supporting Ukraine? This war is endless, and so on and so forth.
I think divided up on different segments. I think on the financial side, which is very important, the money is there, the determination is there, that will happen. And the financial support is very important because what has happened is, of course, nowadays that the Ukrainians are able to produce quite a lot of weapons themselves, but it's depending on money. So the money from Europe is important both for sort of the support for Ukraine in general terms and for supporting Ukrainian primarily drone production, which is also one of the key components of the war. Then you have deliveries of military equipment. Yep, you have an element of problems with that, with sort of storehouses being fairly empty. But a lot of stuff is in Ukraine already. And it's to a large extent now a question of maintaining and repairing equipment. I saw, for example, a report in the Swedish newspapers that the artillery that we have delivered, I mean, the barrels, after how you have used it very heavily, there's a sort of problems with the barrels. That's a problem that has been there enormously in the Russian army, and that's beginning to be in the Ukrainian army. That's a repair thing. And then you have certain items that are rather spare, air defense missiles, for example, when that is something that's going to be of critical importance.
Another extremely important topic is sanctions. One German official, I'm sure you've heard, recently threatened the Russian authorities with sanctions, saying the clock is ticking. Well, the clock keeps ticking and nothing seems to be changing as far as I understand. Europe wanted to impose truly tough sanctions against Russia together with the Americans, but it seems the US isn't going to do anything like that in the foreseeable future. Is Europe ready to act on its own when it comes to the tough restrictive measures?
I think Europe is ready to do it, but the question is how effective is it without the US? And we should also be realistic on sanctions. Sanctions is something that works long term. And what Russia is dependent upon is, of course, primarily oil, the oil export. And the oil is flowing primarily to India and China. And what the EU, together with the US, is trying to do is to take down the prices of oil. That has happened by market forces, by the way. Because if you can't stop the flow of oil, you could at least stop the amount of money that's generated by that. And there you have both the market is taking down oil prices, and you have actions against the sanctions against the so-called shadow fleet. So that is having an effect. But these are long-term things. It doesn't change the dynamic of the war one week from another.
And regarding the deployment of a peacekeeping force, which was considered as a possible guarantee of security for Ukraine immediately after a ceasefire or peace agreement, do you think that scenario is still possible, given that Putin and Lavrov are opposed and Russian officials are strongly insisting they don't want Europeans on Ukrainian territory?
No, but who cares? I mean, that is not a business for Mr. Lavrov. He can say whatever he wants, which he normally does. But he has that I think has to be a very strong position by the Europeans and by the Ukrainians. That's something that we decide. And if we are sending military equipment to Ukraine, it's not in order to please the Kremlin. It is because the Kremlin is doing things that requires defensive measures, and that will continue as long as the Kremlin is pursuing the policy it's doing. So I think what Mr. Lavrov says on that is roughly as relevant as what he says on quite a number of other things. The question is more relevant: what can Europe do? I don't think there will be sort of a huge European force by the Dnieper even after a ceasefire. I think our support should be concentrated on supplying and supporting the Ukrainian defense forces. I mean, Ukraine today has whether the strongest or the second strongest army in Europe, that can be debated, but it's a very strong army. It is very experienced, particularly in defense operations. They have demonstrated that. But they will require money, they will require some more equipment, they will require more training perhaps, and that we should concentrate on and spend the money on, in my opinion. That I think we will do. And if we do that, Ukraine will be perfectly capable of defending itself, as it has already been demonstrated.
But Ukraine needs security guarantees, Mr. Bildt. I've heard Zelensky say this very clearly. He considers it essential. So who will be the one to provide them? Who will act as the buffer?
I've also been listening to President Zelensky, and all Ukrainians are speaking quite a lot about security guarantees. But I mean, in the reality of the world, there are no security guarantees. The security guarantees of Ukraine is the strength of the Ukrainian armed forces, and they are quite effective. I mean, no one expected. I mean, look at the situation. Russia controls a smaller share of Ukraine territory today than 3 years ago, in spite of the Russian army being 3 times as large, and have perhaps lost, I don't know, but hundreds of thousands of soldiers have been killed. So the Russian army is not that impressive. The Ukrainian army is very impressive in its defense capabilities. That is the security guarantee for Ukraine.
Could you answer in one word? Will the war end by the end of 2025? Yes or no? What do you think?
Why do you put these difficult questions to me?
Because you are a very smart man, Mr. Bildt. I'm very curious to hear your answer.
Well, yeah, but that doesn't help. If you had asked me 3 days ago, I would probably reluctantly have said yes. If you ask me today, I would say it's more leaning towards a no.